The wind arrived before the temperature dropped. That is how the old-timers in the northern Dakota Territory always described the worst winters, not by how cold the air became, but by how the wind moved first, low and deliberate across the open grassland, pressing itself against every wall, every gap, every seam of every structure standing between the plains and the horizon. It was January of 1886, and on this particular night, the wind had decided to stay. Across the small settlement of Granton Crossing, a loose collection of homestead claims straddling a frozen creek bed roughly 60 miles northwest of Bismarck. 14 families had already retreated deep into their cabins by nightfall. Fires burned in every hearth. Wood stacked beside every door was disappearing cord by cord as the hours passed. The thermometer nailed to the post office wall had read minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius at 4 in the afternoon and had not moved since. From a distance, any traveler crossing a ridge above the settlement would have seen the same sight repeated in every direction. Thick columns of gray-white smoke climbing from every rooftop, bending sharply east under the force of the wind, the visible proof that inside each of those cabins, someone was feeding fire as fast as they could. Every rooftop, that is, except one, on the southwest edge of the settlement, set slightly apart from the others by a shallow rise of earth and a windbreak of planted cottonwoods, one cabin showed almost no smoke at all. A thin thread, barely visible against the dark sky, curled upward from its stovepipe. The fire inside was burning, but barely, compared to everything around it, and yet the light from its windows was steady and warm, not the frantic orange of fire being pushed to its limit, but the calm amber room that did not need to be fought for. What that cabin held, what its owner had built into its very walls during the weeks before winter, was not magic. It was not luck. It was a result of one woman's careful observation. Her refusal to accept that suffering through winter was the only option, and a construction method so simple and so counterintuitive that her neighbors had called her foolish for attempting it. By morning, they would call her something else entirely. If you ever wonder why some frontier builders stayed warm on a fraction of the firewood their neighbors burned, and what they understood about heat that modern construction forgot, this story is for you. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We have many more stories of forgotten frontier engineering coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. To understand what Marin Caldwell built, you first have to understand what she was building against. Go back 8 months, to the early spring of 1885, when Marin arrived at her claim on the Dakota Plains for the first time. She was 34 years old, a widow from eastern Wisconsin whose husband had died of a fever 2 winters prior, leaving her with a 160-acre homestead claim filed under the Homestead Act, a small amount of savings, a working knowledge of carpentry she had learned from her father, and absolutely no illusions about what lay ahead. The Dakota Territory in the mid-1880s was not a gentle place to begin again. The landscape itself seemed designed to test intention, flat, vast, and unforgiving in a way that is difficult to appreciate without standing in the middle of it. The nearest tree line capable of providing building-grade timber was more than 12 miles to the northeast, along the river breaks. Everything else, the open plains stretching in every direction, offered grass, sky, and wind. Plenty of wind. The settlers who had arrived before Marin had already worked out a rough survival calculus for this landscape. A standard single-room log cabin, if you could source the logs, measured roughly 16 by 20 feet, about 4.9 by 6.1 meters. It required somewhere between 8 and 12 full cord of firewood to survive the winter months from November through March, depending on the severity of the season. 1 cord of firewood measures 4 feet high by 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, roughly 3.6 cubic meters, and weighs between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds, 900 to 1,360 kilograms, when dry, depending on species. Hauling that volume of wood across open plains, with a single horse and a wagon, in autumn mud that could swallow a wheel up to its axle. This was not a minor logistical challenge. It was the central challenge of frontier life in that region. Local accounts from the period described families spending the entire month of October doing almost nothing else but moving and stacking firewood. Every trip a 12-mile round journey to the river breaks and back. And even after all that work, after all those trips, the wood still ran short. Oral histories collected from descendants of Granton Crossing settlers in the early 20th century describe winters where families burned furniture by February, stripped interior wallboard by March, and the worst seasons burned the roof boards themselves rather than freeze. The standard frontier cabin of the 1880s Dakota Plains was not merely uncomfortable in winter. It was, by any reasonable measure, a structural failure at the task it was supposed to perform. The walls were the problem. Settlers understood this in a vague, frustrated way. The cold came through the walls, the wind found every crack, but few thought systematically about what was actually happening at the level of materials and physics. Heat moves. It always moves from where there is more of it to where there is less. A log wall, even a well-chinked one, has a limited capacity to slow that movement. Once the fire in the hearth falls below a certain output, the wall stops resisting and starts conducting, pulling warmth from the interior and releasing to the outside air as fast as a fire can produce it. This is a trap that every family in Granton Crossing lived inside. More fire, more wood, more trips to the river breaks, more exhaustion. And still, by 4 a.m, the temperature inside the cabin had often dropped to within 15 or 20 degrees of the air outside. Marin Caldwell had spent her first spring and summer watching, measuring, and thinking. By the time the cottonwood leaves turned in September of 1885, she had formed an idea that none of her neighbors had tried, and that most of them, when they heard it, refused to take seriously. The standard frontier cabin of the 1880s Great Plains was not built to be warm. It was built to be fast. This distinction matters more than it might seem. The settlers arriving under the Homestead Act were working against a legal clock. Federal law required that a claimant establish residence and make improvements within 5 years to secure title. That pressure, combined with the sheer scarcity of materials on the open plains, meant that most cabins are constructed with a single overriding priority: get the walls up and a roof overhead before the first snowfall. Everything else was secondary. The result was a building type that frontier carpenters, in their more candid moments, described as a two-season structure, adequate in spring and summer, borderline tolerable in fall, and genuinely dangerous in the kind of winter the northern plains could produce without warning. The walls of a typical Granton Crossing cabin consisted of a single layer of logs, roughly 8 to 10 inches, 20 to 25 centimeters, in diameter, notched at the corners and chinked with a mixture of mud, grass, and animal hair. Effective? Barely. The chinking cracked as it dried. The logs shrank across their grain as they cured. Gaps appeared, sometimes narrow as a finger, sometimes wide enough to see daylight through, and the wind found every one of them. On the interior, some settlers nailed boards or stretched canvas over the walls to create a secondary surface, trapping a shallow air pocket between the log and the lining. This helped slightly. A dead air space, even a thin one, provides some insulating value because still air conducts heat poorly. But the air in those cavities was rarely still for long. Convection currents formed as the warmer interior surface heated the air against the log face, causing it to rise and circulate, carrying warmth upward and outward in a slow, continuous loop that could not be stopped without sealing the space entirely. The fireplaces and stoves themselves compounded the problem. Most frontier hearths of this period were open-face designs, a firebox set into one wall, open to the room, with a stone or clay-lined flue rising above. These were capable of producing impressive amounts of radiant heat in the immediate vicinity of the fire. But open fireplaces are notoriously inefficient thermal devices. Studies of comparable historic hearth designs suggest that between 70 and 85% of the heat energy produced by an open fire exits through the chimney flew along with combustion gases, meaning that for every log a settler burned, only 15 to 30% of its stored energy ever reached the room. The rest went up and out into Dakota sky, wasted. At the consumption rates common in Granton Crossing during the winter of 1884 to 85, the winter before Marin's first full season on the claim, local accounts suggest that the average family burned between 9 and 11 cords of wood to survive from November through March. That represented somewhere between 18,000 and 33,000 pounds, 8,200 to 15,000 kilograms of firewood, hauled by hand and horse across 12 miles of rutted plains trail, stacked, split, and fed into a firebox that returned less than a third of its energy to the space it was supposed to heat. Everyone in the settlement knew this system was broken. The older settlers spoke about it with the particular resignation of people who had decided that a problem is simply part of the landscape, as unavoidable as the wind itself. They burned more wood, they slept closer to fire, they wore their coats indoors, and they told their children that this was what winter meant. What none of them had asked, what Marin began asking that first autumn, was whether the wall itself could be made to hold heat rather than surrender it. Marin Caldwell did not arrive at her idea by accident. She arrived at it by paying attention to the wrong things, in exactly the right way. Her neighbors remember her that first summer as a woman who asked too many questions, not about crops or water rights or the price of wheat at the Bismarck railhead, the questions that occupied most of the settlement's attention, but about the cabins themselves. She walked the perimeter of other people's homes on cold mornings, pressing her palm flat against the exterior log faces, feeling where the surface was warmer and where it was colder. She watched where frost formed first on exterior walls and where it melted last. She noted which corners stayed coldest overnight and traced the air movement inside her own cabin with a candle flame held near the baseboards, watching the way the flame bent toward the drafts rising from the floor gaps. Her nearest neighbor, a Norwegian-born farmer named Edvard Solberg, later recalled, in a letter preserved in a regional historical collection, that he found Marin one October morning standing inside her half-finished cabin wall cavity, pressing her ear against the log face as though listening to it. When he asked what she was doing, she told him she was trying to understand what the wall did with heat overnight. Edvard wrote that he walked away thinking she had spent too many months alone on the claim. But Marin was observing something real. The outer surface of a log wall in a heated cabin is almost never as cold as the open air. Even at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius outside, the exterior face of a well-built log wall can sit 10 to 15 degrees warmer than ambient temperature because some of the interior heat is conducting outward through the wood. The log is losing heat, but it is also, briefly, storing it, what has a modest but real thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. The problem was that an 8-inch log wall did not have enough mass to store meaningful amounts of heat, and it had no insulating layer to slow the rate of loss. What if, Marin began to reason, you could add mass to the wall, significant mass, without rebuilding the cabin from scratch? What if you could fill the space between the log face and the interior lining with something dense enough to absorb heat during the hours when the fire burned, and release it slowly during the long, cold hours after the fire died down the coals? The material she arrived at was the one thing the Dakota Plains offered in essentially unlimited supply: firewood itself. The idea crystallized for her sometime in late September of 1885. By her own account recorded in a brief journal entry her granddaughter donated to a local historical society decades later. She wrote, "The wood outside holds no heat because it is outside. The wood inside the stove becomes heat and vanishes. But wood packed tight inside the wall, that is something else. That is a battery." She used the word battery in its older mechanical sense, a store of potential, a reservoir. But the physics she was describing in plain language was thermal mass, the capacity of a dense material to absorb thermal energy and release it over an extended period, buffering the interior temperature against the swings between fire on and fire out. Before we reveal how she built this idea into an actual wall, and whether it worked the way she hoped, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The answer to whether this strange construction actually held heat through a Dakota winter is coming up next, and it is more specific than you might expect. Marin began construction on the modified wall section in the first week of October 1885, working alone and working deliberately. Her cabin's original structure was already standing, a single-room log shell, 16 by 18 feet, for 0.9 by 5.5 meters, with a standard notch corner construction common to the region. The exterior log wall measured approximately 9 inches, 23 centimeters, thick at the log face. Inside, she had already installed a secondary interior lining of rough sawn boards nailed horizontally to interior furring strips set 3 inches, 7.6 centimeters, proud of the log surface, a common practice intended to create that shallow still air cavity mentioned earlier. What Marin did next was remove the interior board lining from the two longest walls, the north wall and the west wall, the two faces most directly exposed to prevailing winter wind, and rebuild the cavity space from scratch but much deeper. She reset her furring strips not 3 inches from the log face, but 16 inches, 40.6 centimeters, creating a cavity nearly a foot and a half deep running the full length of both walls. This was not a small modification. It reduced her interior floor space by approximately 32 square feet, 3 square meters, a meaningful sacrifice in a 288 square foot cabin. Her neighbors, when they heard about it, immediately pointed to this as proof that the idea was foolish. She was making her already small cabin smaller. But Marin was not thinking about floor space. She was thinking about what she was about to put inside those cavities. She filled them with firewood, not loose firewood, not the kind of haphazard stack you might pile beside a porch. She selected straight, dry pieces of split hardwood, primarily cottonwood and a smaller quantity of elm she'd been able to source from the river breaks, and stacked them horizontally into the wall cavity, bark side out toward the exterior log face, cut face inward toward the interior lining. Each piece measured between 14 and 16 inches, 35 to 41 centimeters, long, fitting the cavity almost exactly. She stacked them tightly, row by row, from floor to ceiling, packing the gaps between irregular pieces with dried grass and with shavings tamped firmly into place. The physics of what she had built can be explained simply. Wood is a reasonable thermal mass material, not as effective as stone or adobe by weight, but far better than still air. Dry hardwood has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.45 to 0.57 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, meaning it can absorb a significant amount of heat energy before its temperature rises appreciably. More importantly, it releases that stored heat slowly, over hours, not minutes. The wall cavity Marin created on her north side alone measure approximately 16 feet long, by 7 feet high, by 16 inches deep, 4.9 by 2.1 by 0.4 meters. Filled with split firewood at a packing density she could achieve by hand, that cavity held somewhere between 1,800 and 2,400 pounds, 820 to 1,090 kilograms, of dry wood. This was not firewood waiting to be burned. This was thermal mass, a dense, slow-reacting reservoir of stored heat capacity built directly into the wall structure of the cabin. During the hours when her small cast-iron stove burned steadily, the interior air temperature rose, warming the interior board lining, which conducted heat slowly into the packed wood mass behind it. The wood absorbed this heat without burning. It was not exposed to flame or direct combustion, only to warm, dry air. And because the same dense mass separated the interior from the cold exterior log face, it dramatically slowed the rate at which cold could conduct inward from outside. The secondary effect was equally important. The firewood acted as a wind barrier. One of the primary heat losses in a frontier cabin was infiltration, cold outside air forcing its way through gaps in the log wall, and the chinking, displacing warm interior air. A cavity packed solidly with split represented almost no pathway for air infiltration. The wind that had always found its way through Edvard Solberg's cabin walls found, in Marin's modified walls, something close to a solid mass. She finished packing the second wall cavity in late October and replaced the interior board lining, then sealed every seam with mixture of clay and grass fiber she had prepared through the summer. When she stepped back and looked at the finished interior, the cabin appeared, to any casual observer, completely normal. The walls looked like walls. The floor space was reduced, yes, but not dramatically. What was invisible was the 3,200 to 4,000 pounds, 1,450 to 1,815 kilograms of tightly packed hardwood now embedded in the two most exposed faces of her home, waiting, like a slow battery, for the cold to arrive and test it. She did not have to wait long. Word travels fast in a small settlement, especially when the news involves something that sounds dangerous. By the second week of October, most of Granton Crossing knew what Marin Caldwell was doing inside her cabin walls. Edvard Solberg had mentioned it to his wife, who had mentioned it to the family at the adjacent claim, and within days the story had taken on particular shape that unusual ideas tend to acquire in tight-knit communities. It had become slightly more extreme, slightly more reckless in each retelling, until the version circulating through the settlement described Marin as having packed her walls floor to ceiling with raw green timber and then sealed the whole thing shut with clay. The reaction was swift and, by the account of several neighbors, recorded in regional oral history collections from the early 20th century, genuinely alarmed. This was not simple mockery. Some of the concern came from people who knew construction, and their objections were technically coherent, which made them worth taking seriously. Clarence Holt, who had been building frontier structures across the Dakota Territory for nearly 15 years by that point, and whose opinion carried real weight in the settlement, walked over to Marin's claim one afternoon to inspect the work firsthand. He stood inside the modified cabin for a long time, pressing his hand against the new interior lining, tapping it with his knuckle, running his fingers along the sealed seams. Then he stepped back and delivered his verdict in the measured, regretful tone of someone who does not enjoy being the bearer of bad news. "The wood would rot," he said, packed tight against a log exterior wall with no ventilation. The moisture that naturally migrated through a log structure during winter, driven inward by vapor pressure as the exterior surface froze and the interior remained warm, would have nowhere to go. It would condense inside the cavity and saturate the packed firewood within 2 or 3 seasons. Rotted wood insulates poorly. Worse, rotted wood in an enclosed wall cavity is a breeding ground for structural decay that spreads silently until the wall fails entirely. This was a legitimate concern. Moisture management in dense wall assemblies is a real and well-documented challenge, one that would occupy building scientists seriously in the following century. Clarence Holt did not know the physics terminology, but he had watched enough frontier cabins deteriorate over 15 Dakota winters to recognize the pattern. His objection was not ignorance. It was experience. His second concern was fire. Dry hardwood packed into a wall cavity, he argued, was fuel waiting for a path to ignition. A chimney fire, a stovepipe overheating, a spark from a failing flue seal. Any of these could, in his estimation, find its way to the wood mass inside the wall and produce a fire that burned from the inside out, invisible until the wall itself was fully involved. "You won't see it coming," he told her. "By the time you smell it, it's already in the wall." 2 other men from the settlement stopped by in the following days with variations of the same arguments. One pointed out that the reduced interior space would make the cabin harder to heat uniformly. The corners opposite the stove would stay cold regardless of what was in the walls. Another simply shook his head and said she was throwing away good firewood that she would need by February. Marin listened to each of them without interrupting. She had already thought through most of these objections during the weeks she spent planning the modification. And she had answers, practical, reasoned answers rooted in what she had observed during her first Dakota winter and in the logic she had worked out for herself through the summer. But she understood, intuitively, that this was not a moment for debate. The only argument that would convince her neighbors was not a verbal one. On the moisture question, she had made 2 decisions during construction that she believed addressed the core of Clarence's concern. First, she had used only fully seasoned, dry split hardwood, wood that had been cut and stacked in open air for at least 1 full summer before being packed into the cavity. Dry wood at less than 20% moisture content does not readily absorb additional moisture from air movement. It actually resists it to a significant degree, particularly when packed densely enough to limit air circulation within the cavity itself. Second, she had left a 2-inch, 5-centimeter, gap between the packed wood mass and the interior board lining, creating a narrow but continuous ventilated channel on the warm side of the assembly, the side facing the heated room, that allowed any moisture-laden air rising from the wood to escape upward and out through small gaps at the top plate rather than condense inside the mass. On the fire question, she was direct. The wood inside her wall was not more flammable than the wood comprising every other cabin in the settlement. A log wall is fuel. A board lining is fuel. The packed firewood in her cavity was separated from the stovepipe by the full interior width of the room and had no contact with any combustion surface. The risk she was managing was the same risk every settler managed every winter. The difference was that her wood mass was enclosed and stationary rather than stacked beside an open flame. She told none of this to Clarence Holt or to the others who came to warn her. She thanked them for their concern, offered them coffee from the pot on her stove, and went back to sealing the last of the wall seams. Winter, she had decided, would make the argument for her. The winter of 1885 to 86 did not arrive gradually on the northern Dakota plains. It arrived the way the worst winters always do in that region, without sufficient warning and without apology. The first serious cold came in the third week of November, a week earlier than the previous year and noticeably harder. By the end of the month, temperatures at Granton Crossing had dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius on multiple consecutive nights. By the second week of December, the thermometer outside the post office was reading minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 degrees Celsius before midnight, and the wind, always the wind, was driving snow horizontally across the open plain in conditions that made travel between neighboring claims genuinely hazardous. This was, as oral accounts from the period describe it, a season that tested everything. Livestock that had survived previous winters did not survive this one. Crops that had been stored with ordinary care froze solid in their root cellars. Families that had calculated their firewood supply based on the previous 3 seasons found themselves running short by January, sometimes badly short. In Granton Crossing, Clarence Holt's cabin, a well-built structure by the standards of the settlement, with tight chinking and a reasonably efficient box stove, was consuming between 1 and 1.5 cords of wood per week by mid-December, according to his own later account. At that rate, his 10-cord supply would last him until late February at best, leaving March, historically one of the most dangerous months on the northern plains, when winter cold persists but firewood supplies are exhausted, dangerously underprovided. The pattern was similar across the settlement. Families were burning between 0.8 and 1.4 cords per week depending on cabin size, construction quality, and the efficiency of their stoves. Interior overnight temperatures in most cabins, measured against the stove's burn cycle, dropped between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius to 9 degrees Celsius, in the hours before dawn. Cold enough that water left in a bucket near the wall would develop a skin of ice by morning. Marin Caldwell's cabin was operating on a different schedule. The cast-iron stove she used, a modest parlor stove of a common frontier design, smaller than what Clarence Holt ran in his own cabin, was burning at an average rate that her journal entries from that period suggest was roughly half to 2/3 of what her neighbors were consuming for comparable interior temperatures. Local accounts, including a letter from Edvard Solberg written to his brother in Norway during that winter and preserved in a family collection, described visiting Marin's cabin on a morning when the outside temperature had fallen to minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 32 degrees Celsius, and finding the interior at what he estimated as a full room warmth, meaning warm enough to sit without a coat, which he placed at somewhere above 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius, based on his description of removing his outer garments upon entering. The mechanism was exactly what Marin had predicted, and it operated on a principle that any frontier settler could have understood if someone had explained it in physical rather than abstract terms. During the hours when her stove burned at moderate output, roughly 6 to 8 hours each evening, the interior air temperature climbed to between 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius to 23 degrees Celsius. During those hours, the interior board lining of her modified walls absorbed heat steadily. Behind that lining, the 3,200 to 4,000 pounds, 1,450 to 1,815 kilograms of packed dry hardwood absorbed heat more slowly, which thermal response time is measured in hours, not minutes, but absorbed it continuously, its temperature rising degree by degree throughout the evening as the room stayed warm around it. When the fire dropped to coals sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, the process reversed but slowly. The packed wood mass, now holding several hours' worth of stored thermal energy, began releasing it back into the room at the same gradual rate it had absorbed it. The interior board lining, warmed from behind by the wood mass and from in front by the residual room air, continued radiating heat into the space long after the active flame had died. The result, documented in Marin's own journal entries and corroborated by Edvard Solberg's letter, was that her cabin's overnight temperature drop was dramatically shallower than what her neighbors experienced. Where a standard Granton Crossing cabin might fall from 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius at 10 in the evening to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius by 5 in the morning, a drop of 26 degrees Fahrenheit over 7 hours, Marin's cabin, under comparable exterior conditions, dropped from approximately 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius at 10 in the evening to somewhere between 54 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius by 5 in the morning, a drop of 12 to 16 degrees Fahrenheit over the same period. That difference, 10 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit warmer at the coldest point of the night, was not a minor comfort improvement. On a night when outside temperatures were approaching minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 34 degrees Celsius, it was a difference between a cabin where a family could sleep without waking to feed the fire, and a cabin where someone had to rise every 2 to 3 hours through the night to keep the temperature above the danger threshold for children and elderly occupants. The reduced with consumption followed directly from this dynamic, because the thermal mass in Marin's walls was releasing stored heat during the overnight hours. Her stove did not need to burn at full output to maintain livable temperatures. She was, in effect, running her fire for 6 to 8 hours and getting 14 to 16 hours of useful heat from each burn cycle. Her estimated weekly wood consumption through December and January ran between 0.45 and 0.6 cords, roughly 40 to 55% of what Clarence Holt was burning in a comparable cabin with a similar stove. By February, when several families in the settlement were making emergency trips to the river breaks in midwinter conditions to replenish their failing wood supplies, Marin Stack, calculated at the outset for 7 cords, still had more than 3 cords remaining. She would finish the winter with cord and a half to spare. The firewood inside her walls had never been touched. It did not need to be. It had done its work not as fuel, but as something the settlers did not have a precise word for: a thermal reservoir, a slow battery of stored warmth, a wall that remembered the heat of the evening and gave it back to the coldest hours of the night. Spring came late to Granton Crossing in 1886, as it often did after a hard winter, and when it finally arrived, it brought with it the particular kind of conversation that follows a season of genuine difficulty. Honest, quiet, and specific in a way that people are rarely specific when things are going well. Clarence Holt was among the first to come to Marin's cabin that April. He came without announcement in the early morning, and he asked to see the wall cavities. Marin pulled back a section of the interior lining she had designed to be removable for exactly this purpose, anticipating, perhaps, that she would eventually need to show someone. And Clarence stood for a long time looking at the tightly packed firewood inside. The wood was dry, not damp, not discolored, not showing the early gray staining that signals fungal activity in a moisture-compromised assembly. The pieces she had packed in October were, to all visible appearances, in the same condition they had been when she installed them. Clarence pressed his palm against the interior face of the wood mass and held it there. He said nothing for a moment. Then he asked her to explain from the beginning exactly how she had managed the moisture gap on the warm side of the assembly. She explained it. He listened. He asked 2 or 3 technical questions. The kind of questions a man asks when he is not looking for reasons to disagree, but is genuinely trying to understand the system. Then he nodded slowly and told her that he had been wrong about the rot. He did not say it in those words exactly, but he said enough. Over the following summer, 3 families in the settlement modified their own cabin walls using variations of Marin's method. Edvard Solberg rebuilt the north and west walls of his cabin with a 14-inch, 35-centimeter, packed with cavity, following her basic approach but substituting a portion of the wood mass with flat fieldstone he gathered from the creek bed, stone having a higher heat capacity by volume than wood, though significantly heavier and harder to source in quantity on the open plains. His modification, by his own account in subsequent letters, reduced his wood consumption the following winter by what he estimated as 1/3 compared to his previous practice. A 4th family, the Browers, who had arrived late in the 1885 season and had not yet finished their cabin interior, built the modified wall assembly from scratch rather than retrofitting it, a considerably easier process, as Marin had discovered to the difficulty of her own retrofit work. Their version used a 12-inch, 30-centimeter cavity packed with split cottonwood and chinked with dried grass and clay, with the ventilated channel on the interior face that Marin had pioneered. Local accounts suggest their first full winter in the cabin was, by their report, the warmest they had experienced in any frontier structure. The technique did not spread beyond the immediate settlement in any documented way. There was no newspaper article, no agricultural extension bulletin, no published account that carried Marin Caldwell's name or her method to the wider Dakota Territory or beyond. What spread instead was what always spreads in frontier communities: practical knowledge passed neighbor to neighbor, adapted and modified by each new hand that applied it, losing its origin and keeping its function. This is how most of the best frontier engineering traveled. Not through publication, not through formal instruction, but through demonstration. One cabin standing warmer than its neighbors through one hard winter, and a community of observant, practical people who knew how to learn from what they could see with their own eyes. The physics that Marin applied, thermal mass, slow heat release, moisture management, infiltration reduction, are not historical curiosities. They are the foundation of every serious passive heating and building envelope strategy developed in the 20th and 21st centuries. Modern construction science has produced insulation materials, vapor barriers, and thermal break assemblies that perform the same functions Marin achieved with split cottonwood and dry grass, with considerably greater precision and reliability. But the underlying principle, that a dense, slow-reacting mass within a wall assembly can store heat during active firing periods and release it during cold periods, reducing both temperature swings and fuel consumption, is unchanged. It is the same principle expressed in the same physics that one woman on the northern Dakota plains worked out for herself in the fall of 1885 because she was paying attention to things her neighbors had decided were not worth examining. There is something worth sitting within that. The frontier was not short of intelligent people. It was not short of experienced builders, practical thinkers, or men and women who understood cold and fire and would in ways that most modern people never will. What was sometimes shorter was the willingness to question a system that everyone had agreed to treat as fixed, to look at a wall and ask not, how do I put more heat into the room, but how do I make the room hold the heat it already has? Marin Caldwell asked that question. The winter of 1885 to 86 answered it. The answers the frontier produced, in packed walls, in stone thermal masses, in sod construction that used the Earth's own temperature as a buffer, in the 100 small engineering decisions that kept families alive through winters that modern heating systems would handle without a second thought, are not primitive solutions to primitive problems. They are sophisticated responses to a resource constraint that force builders to think about energy with a precision that abundance has since made unnecessary. They deserve to be remembered, not because we are likely to need them in exactly the form Marin used them, though the principles remain valid and replicable, but because the kind of thinking they represent is always worth preserving. The ability to look at a problem that everyone else has accepted as unsolvable and to find in the materials already at hand an answer that works. That is what this channel is here to explore. The engineering that did not make it into the textbooks. The solutions that spread neighbor to neighbor and then disappeared when the neighbors moved on. The walls that held heat through the night when every other cabin had gone cold. If this story gave you something to think about, whether you are a builder, a history enthusiast, someone preparing for a winter off the grid, or simply a person who finds something satisfying in watching a good idea prove itself in the cold, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what you found most surprising, or ask a question about the construction method, and we will do our best to address it, like this video, if it was worth your time. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the stories that are coming next, because there are many of them, and they are just as specific, just as strange, and just as worth knowing as the one you just heard. The frontier had a lot of good ideas that the world forgot. We are not done finding them.